Welcome back to another episode of The Hip. My name is James Layton, CEO and founder of Anderson James. This is the podcast where every single week I bring you a leader from our sector to discuss some of the biggest challenges in UK housing today. Today I was delighted to be joined by Dave Richmond, Chief Executive Officer at St Ledger Homes of Doncaster. We talk about all things housing affordability, supporting the most vulnerable, including care leavers, and why the social housing market is in desperate need of a healthy private rental sector. It was a really interesting story and one that shows that it's an interesting transition from local authority into a housing provider. I hope you enjoy the episode, and if you do, I'd ask that you like and subscribe. Dave, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm excited for this. As we always like to start, do you mind just giving us an introduction to yourself for the listeners?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm employed as Chief Exec at St Ledger Homes of Doncaster, which is the Doncaster Council's arm's length management organisation.
Yeah.
And I've been here for nearly 3 years now. Before that, I was Housing Director in Hull for a number of years, and before that, Housing Director in Rotherham. Before that, so this is, I'm getting on a bit, so this is quite a long sort of potted history, really. I suppose really to say that my original career was in social work. I trained as a social worker in the 80s. And I kind of fell into that because, my dad was a shop blaster, worked abroad on big industrial things like bridges or oil rigs, and spent the last 40 years of his life in Norway. But my mum did all sorts of things. And she started off as an assistant social worker, and I thought that looked quite good. So I applied for university, not knowing she'd also applied. So we both got accepted onto the social work course at Hull University in 1982. And as a result, I went to Nottingham. I couldn't face the idea of sat there with my mother in the class. So I started off as a social worker and spent nearly 20 years doing that. Things have changed, but I guess I would have been called head of safeguarding now. And then I just thought I wanted to play on a wider scale and a wider stage and have more of an impact. And I thought housing gave me that opportunity to impact on the lives of lots of people.
Yeah.
And to be honest, that's how it's been borne out. So I switched to housing best part of 20 years ago, and I've been doing that since.
Amazing. And I know you spent time in local government. How would you say that prepared you for working for an arm's length management organisation and working at St Ledger? What were some of the things that prepared you for that, would you say? I've spent my whole life in local government. Always in Yorkshire. I think I've been with about 7 authorities in Yorkshire. And I think it has prepared me really well. The difference that you get working in local authorities as opposed to perhaps a housing association is that you get a much broader experience and a much broader opportunity to impact on the things that impact on tenants. And tenants' experience is not just borne out about the conditions of the home, but it's borne out by the conditions of the neighbourhood. What's the street scene like? Do the bins get empty? Is there a park? What's the local schools? And working in local government, you're rubbing shoulders with the people who are managing those services all the time. And as you get further up, you get more of an opportunity to try and influence that. So, when I was in Hull, for example, when we'd get our star results, we'd sit down with the director of street scene because he'd be just as interested in the things that our tenants were saying as we were. And, you've got an opportunity to shape services. So the other thing is obviously the political dimension you get in working in local government, and just understanding that, and that has real strengths, but also it has trade-offs and it has political considerations you have to think about. So you may have instances where, in terms of how it prepares you for that there's going to be trade-offs. You're not necessarily going to do the things you want to do, but the politicians are looking on a broader scale and at different priorities. And that can, for good or ill, impact on the way you operate in housing. Yeah. And I've got a few questions on that, but the first one would be,
you'll understand the value of the relationship between local authority and provider, I presume, like, and how important that is because you've worked both sides.
Yeah, I have worked both sides, and I'm probably there's probably not a lot of chief execs of Halmos that have done that, and probably not a lot that have been responsible for ending the contract of an Almo, as I was back in 2010, 2011 in Rotherham. Um, and and really, what I'd say about that is the main issue is actually about, well, obviously performance. Performance is key wherever you are, but beyond that, the issue is about trust. The issue is about the nature of that relationship. Are you trusted to deliver the council services with this degree of arm's length nature? Um, can your word be trusted or not? And that strength of relationship. And when you actually look at a number of Almos that have gone back in house, it has been about um, performance, but also that trust. And certainly when I was in Rotherham, one of the issues was that we felt as though the Almo saw themselves as a housing association, and it's not. It's not. It's the delivery arm of the council, and it felt as though the expectations and the visions of the two organisations were not aligning; they're actually diverging, and I think that's probably one of the key drivers that for that ending of the Almo contract at that time. It's a long time ago, but also I think a general point as well. So that nature of the relationship is absolutely fundamental.
Yeah, and I suppose from piecing that all together, I'd say you would be a big supporter of people working both sides. You know, having an experience in local authority would give them a better grounding when they do become a chief exec of an Almo or a housing association. It gives you a nicer feel for the place.
I think it's a great grounding, really. And I think, as I said, it broadens your horizon a little bit, but also gives you that real sense of the politics. And even for housing associations, actually having that political dimension and that relationship with the local councils, I think is pretty important. Um, but understanding that people will see things differently to how you do. That there are things I want to do running an Almo where I think I can do this better or I can do that more efficiently. But politically, that's not feasible. That's just not where they want to be. So there are those trade-offs. Understanding that, it's certainly in the Almo world is important, but to a lesser degree also for housing associations, that the councils will not always be able to do what you think is evidently sensible.
Absolutely.
That they've got other factors that they're impinging on them.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point, and I think it's a nice way to start. And sort of, you've worked across, like you say, local authorities and the Almo. What's been the landscape, and how have you seen the housing landscape change in Yorkshire over your career and your time?
Well, I knew you were going to ask me that, and I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, actually, if I describe some of it back in the 80s and 90s, people today won't believe it, really. So, at that point, I was working in Hull, and we had, within the council housing system, we had thousands of properties we just couldn't let.
Right.
Actually, we could get nobody to go into them. And that's not because they were, nearly slum condition or whatever. They're actually quite decent, but they're in the wrong area, or people aspired to home ownership at that time a lot more, and affordability wasn't such a big problem. I mean, Hull may be a little bit different to some areas, but because it's a relatively cheap housing area. But we demolished houses just because we couldn't let them. It's unthinkable now that we'd be demolishing good quality housing because we couldn't get people to go the 3 miles out to that estate or whatever. So that's changed considerably, and obviously during that period we've seen just a massive rise in right to buy, massive rise in the size and scale of the PRS. I mean, in long-term historical terms, that's not surprising, but over the last 20-30 years it's a big change, and that's changed the nature of the housing world, I think, in terms of the sense of these monolithic council estates you might have seen in the 80s no longer exist. Even whichever estate you look at, you've got significant penetration rates. If you go into more affluent, greener areas of Yorkshire, you're going to see
almost all stock transferred. I mean, I live just north of Leeds in a small market town called Wetherby, and there is council housing here, but the vast majority of it is all right to buy. So, but even in, when I was in Hull a couple of years back, we would have penetration rates of 50-60% on some estates. So they're no longer as they were. And I think it's linked, but clearly during that period, the issue of affordability has just changed massively. I mean, talking on a personal level, when I was 16 in the late 70s, my parents split, and my mum was a cleaner at that time. My dad was working abroad, and my dad was coming home from holiday and from work for a holiday. And my mum says, right, I'm leaving him, we're going. And I'm like, what? What's happening? And I said, well, where are we going? And she took me down this street, and she had 2 houses she'd bought. She'd bought 2 houses. There were 2 up, 2 downs, tiny terrace things, outside bathrooms and whatever. But as a cleaner, she'd bought 2 houses. I was just like, how the hell did that happen? And those houses now, they'd still be relatively cheap over in Hull, but you're probably looking at 100 grand each. How would But at that time, I remember she paid 4.5 grand for them. It's like
Crazy.
So affordability has just changed the market considerably, and and I do think right to buy has had a big impact on that. With a move into right to buy properties being sold and ended up in the hands of private landlords and the rate changes. So renting within the private sector has gone massively. There's a massive rise in homelessness presentations and the pressure on that. And not surprisingly, as the housing stocks dwindled, the social housing stocks didn't dwindle. Allocation policies have become much more targeted. So, we are now in Doncaster predominantly letting to those people that we have in our highest priority band. And those are the people that are already homeless, or they're fleeing domestic violence, or they're care leavers. And that has an impact in terms of those council housing areas that, we're going to a less varied population within those areas. That going back to the 80s, where you might have had more up working class people and sometimes even middle class people living in properties, that's changing significantly. It's inevitable that you're going to target when you've got less resource, but it does have an impact in terms of cohesive communities, I think, and mixed communities.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's so interesting that, like, I've heard that story before about someone buying a house for 4.5. I mean, you just, and I'm not saying cleaner, but like on a lower salary in this world now, you've got no hope of buying a property in most cases, have you? In terms of the gulf of affordability has changed so dramatically in that period of time. I mean, so dramatically. It's so difficult now to get on that property ladder, which is a cause for concern, and it's widening, isn't it, every year, I think.
It is. I mean, I'd like to talk a bit more about that rise in prices particularly in the private rented sector, but also to some degree in the social and affordable sectors. But yeah, it's becoming more and more problematical for people, I think, and we're seeing a number of now private renters really struggling and, being evicted or giving up their properties just because of affordability. And the prospect of buying, I mean, I've got 2 lads that are both just finishing university. One has been living in a council flat in London, in Clerkenwell. It's quite a reasonable area of London. And he shares what would have been a 2.5 bedroomed council flat, 4 of them in it. There's no living room any longer. He has the living room. And they were both paying, all 4 of them were paying about £800 a month. So that's £32,000 for a year for a council flat. And my eldest, who's just about to start work, had the opportunity to go into London working for the civil service or coming to more northern areas, and he was quite keen on Manchester, but for various reasons he's going to Leeds. And I thought, great, this is going to be much more affordable for him. He's going to earn a fixed salary, and we've just signed him up for a flat, or he's just signed up for a flat, and I think he's paying £875 a month, which is still a hell of a salary for somebody in the first job. So you've got to be on a decent salary. I mean, he's fortunate. He's going to be upper 20s, lower 30s. But, if you're going into a job on 20 grand, 25 grand, that is a hell of a cost.
It is. And I want to come back on that. I really want to focus on the private sector rent and the gap. And I've got some questions for you on that. But just as you reflect on how housing's changed from a leadership perspective in that time, I'm interested to say, like, when you started your career in local authorities to now, today, what are some of the skills that you've observed that you now need that you didn't need back then in terms of when you were working in this sector?
Well, that's an interesting question. Probably one I've not given an awful lot of thought of, but certainly within the local authority sector, and bearing in mind I've always worked in northern Yorkshire-based areas, Labour-led, it's changed enormously, actually. That sense of professionalism. Housing, I don't want to say too much because I get myself in trouble, but housing was a bit of a jobs for the boys area. It was, if you knew the right people, you'd get a start in housing. You didn't have to have a degree. You didn't have to have, a desire for a career in housing. It was a job. And I think that's changing considerably.
I agree.
But some of that, it's not that long ago. It's all to do about perspective in it. I'm knocking on 60, so what's not long ago to me might be ages ago to other people. But some of those people that came into that career sort of 25, 30 years ago now have worked their way up and may now be in middle management or whatever. And they've got there because of time served and experience. And some of them are really good, without a doubt, but some of them perhaps less so. So I think there's a real professionalism issue. Obviously the government and CIH are pushing heavily at that, and I really welcome that. I think that is different, and I do think that it's got the management tasks got harder, without a doubt, just because of that issue that I was saying about earlier about pressure on tenants and aspiring tenants and the conditions they're in. The fact that we increasingly let to people that have got greater levels of need means you do have to have a wider perspective. And I think, and I often say to my staff that I think perhaps a different perspective to some people because of that background I had in social work. I've come into this from a very people orientated focus, and I think housing is all about people. It's not about houses. That's just a given. That's just a tool you're using. That's just, you've got to get your equipment or your houses absolutely spot on. That's a given. But it's beyond that. It's about the impact you have on people's lives.
I agree.
So I think in terms of the leadership challenge, it's probably around having that wider perspective and understanding about how can you help people. If you're working in a housing association in a more affluent area, it might be quite different, but certainly in inner city northern towns, I think that understanding of addictions, of understanding of poverty, employment prospects, that all of that issue, those issues are more fundamental, and being willing to engage with others to try and influence on those factors. Housing clearly can't do an awful lot on its own. It requires others. So that partnership agenda, that partnership working, much more fundamental, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I lived in social housing when I was growing up, and it was fine. But I think the expectations of social housing, rightfully so, and the expectations of residents and tenants have become greater over the time. There's more readily available to give feedback. You can get lifetime reviews on what you're doing. The expectation has moved on an awful long way since 25 years ago when I lived in social housing. So I think it has changed a lot from that perspective as well.
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely see that. And, we can see it on the consumer satisfaction testing we do. If you break it down by age demographic, it's inevitably the older people that are more satisfied. The younger middle-aged people,
Absolutely.
even, that are less willing to take poor standards, and quite rightly so.
Exactly.
But it has raised the profile. I mean, there are some real challenges in that. we have an average rent in Doncaster of £81 a week, which I think, so what's that? Sort of 320, £330 a month.
Yeah.
You know, that brings with it a challenge about how do you provide top-notch quality housing and the related services that I think we increasingly need at that price. And you know, we have quite high complaints levels, much higher than I'd like to see. Dissecting some of those, a number are about, in my view, people wanting a repair done today or tomorrow, in a way that you just wouldn't be able to do in the private rented sector or in the homeowner sector. So people do have really high expectations of the same standards they'd get anywhere else or higher, but to be honest, at a much lower price point than you'd pay elsewhere. That enables you to deliver some of that. So that's a real conundrum.
It's the same as, like, I've got a daughter 13 and everything's instant. You know, if it's not instant, it's too slow. And the problem is like, we can't keep up with the demand. It's just too difficult to be everything to be instant, especially in a repair service. We'll move on. Just for the benefit of the listeners, not myself, like, just give us a helicopter overview of St Ledger Homes as it stands today, just in terms of size of properties. Like, just give us a bit of an overview of the business.
Okay, so as I said, we're the arm's length contractor for Doncaster Council. Great timing, really, James, because yesterday there was a report at Cabinet that's just renewed our management agreement for the next 5 years. So we've got a contract for the next 5 years, which is fantastic, and settles everybody down. They know where they're going to be working. And, it's great news. And but St Ledger, it's a 20,000 home business. We manage some shops on behalf of the council. We've got some land that we do. We employ about 800 staff. We do things in we have an in-house repair service, so we're predominantly in-house. We do use external contractors for what I call pressure cooker services. So where we know demand's gonna be seasonal or you know, it's beyond our skill level or whatever, we use private contractors for that. We have a small private rental business, so we manage about 200 private rental properties. We also manage the council's homelessness and allocation service. So we've almost got the full gamut of social housing services. We don't do anything around environmental health service or anything like that. We, as I say, about 800 staff. We're quite proud of some of the services that we've got. We've got a small employment and training business. We don't do any building, although we do acquisition and refurbishment work.
Right. Okay. And I want to get back to the point of, I know from speaking to you offline a lot about this, is that you're going to be wax lyrical about this. But, you know, one thing that we need to work on is narrowing the gap between private sector rent and the housing allowance, clearly. Like, there's a big piece of work that needs to be done. But what we're seeing, I think you said we're seeing a 20% increase across the north. Is that right?
Well, depending on what you look at, private rents have been running somewhere between 10 to 12, 13% increase in each of the last 2 to 3 years. Right. So they're going up considerably. Okay.
And like, what challenge does that pose for our sector, do you think? And how can we work together to solve that issue? Because, like we've talked about, the widening is evident, certainly from an affordability perspective. But what's your views on it all, and how can we work together to solve that issue?
Yeah, to be honest, I think this is a self-evident point, but for me, it wasn't self-evident for quite a few years. But actually, the sectors are absolutely interdependent. Absolutely interdependent. I mean, I have had responsibilities in the past for private sector enforcement activity and whatever. So trying to deal with poor standards in the private sector. So I that sense of actually really understanding the need to coexist and cooperate grew over time for me. And obviously, when you're talking about the private sector, you're talking about a massive range of different types of properties, some from very poor conditions to some absolutely top-notch, fantastic conditions. So it is a range. So I don't want to say anything that could be perceived as being disparaging at all. But without a doubt, price rises have risen beyond inflation levels and also wage rises in the private rented sector. And it's become much more difficult to find something affordable for people that are on more restricted wage or income levels.
Yeah.
The impact on that is that that has led people, understandably, to try and access accommodation that's more affordable and approaching the housing associations and the local authorities. So we've seen a massive amount of demand increase as a result of that, some of which is in crisis because of potential evictions and because of due to unpaid rent in the private sector. But the majority of people realising that it's just not affordable for them anymore. So increasing demand, increasing homelessness, some of that in crisis. One of the things that I did want to talk about, if I got chance, was people on benefits in the private rented sector. And as that right to buy has increased over the years, and the amount of stock in the social housing and sector in particular, affordable housing slightly different, but has dwindled, more and more people that are benefit dependent have ended up in the private rented sector. So I can say, for example, in Doncaster, we have somewhere in the region of 10,000 tenants, households, that are claiming benefits that are in the private rented sector.
Wow.
Significant. And the government, in terms of the changes in benefits, have played around quite a lot with how much they'll give people to pay their rent. And the local housing allowance, when it first was introduced, was pegged at 50% of the market rate for private rental. So then it was reduced to 30%, and then it got frozen. When Rishi Sunak became Chancellor, he put it back to the 30%, which was fantastic. That was in 2020. But he then froze it for 3 years. So at exactly the same time as we've seen that significant increase in private rental rents. So if you look now, information from the Northern Housing Consortium, and it's a year, 18 months out of date, because time lags on data, was saying that somewhere between 3 and 8% of properties in the north are affordable for people on benefits within the amount of housing allowance. They don't call it that now, but the LHA that they can acquire. So you've got a significant number of people in private rental that can't access social or affordable housing, going into the private renter, chasing very, very few properties that they can actually afford. And as a result, if they're getting them, they're often subsidising them with other elements of their benefits, money that's meant to pay for the food or clothing or whatever, or savings. And it's just increasingly rising, increasingly encouraging poverty. So I've got some publicly available data from the DWP that says in Doncaster, they know that of the 10,000 renters, 6,500 or so get less in their benefits for housing than they're paying in their rent. So the government know that people are not getting enough to pay their rent in the private rental sector. They know they can't access social housing because of the amount of people on the registers and lists, etc. It's a problem in the north. It's a bigger problem in London and the southeast, etc. But it's a nationwide issue. And I've been trying to. There's been a lot in the press about this, but the thing that I really do think the government needs to do is they need to stop freezing the LHA. They need to peg it at 30%. I think most of the industry would accept that. The other thing that they need to do, and it's kind of self-evident, really, but in calculating the LHA, they calculate on the amount of rent people pay. But the amount of rent people pay is not the amount you would pay if you were looking for a property now. Because what landlords do, if they've got a good tenant, they try and keep the rent down. They try and not put it up a lot. And then when that tenant moves on, they use that as an opportunity to put the rent back up. So they're catching up with the fact that they've got cost rises, usually at the point, not exclusively, obviously, but often at the point of relet. So there's quite a difference between rents paid and rents advertised, and the LHA don't take account of that. So it's inevitable. Whilst it's meant to be pegged at this 30%, actually it's a much smaller fraction available. So that's creating a lot of problem.
Yeah, and I've got a few things there. What are you seeing, Dave, from your registers? Like, what does Doncaster look like today for you in terms of people registering for social housing? I mean, has it increased in the last couple of years? Have you seen an uptick in terms of the amount of people that need your help?
It has increased, but more significantly, the big change is in the numbers in the higher bands. So those that are in greatest need. I mean, we have a platinum, gold, silver, bronze type approach to life, and the numbers in platinum, I think, have doubled in the last couple of years. So
Wow.
people in really dire need, and we're seeing that being based on homelessness, rising homelessness. We're now getting somewhere in the region of 2,500 approaches every month of people fearing homelessness. A massive rise in people fleeing domestic violence. So the register's always a little bit tricky to talk about because, there are technical reasons about why registers exist like they do. If you write to people and say, do you want to be on the register? We're closing it. We're going to start a new one tomorrow. Not everybody writes back. So the registers come right down and then they creep up over time. And some people, more traditionally than now, I think, some people are rainy days of registered people. They put the names down because, at 20, because at 40 or 60, sorry, they might want a bungalow, and they're not going to bid in between. So I wouldn't want to be masked by that. But generally what we're seeing is a much higher element of need coming through and people in more desperate circumstances. So I think that's self-evident right across the north, actually.
I agree, and I live in Manchester, and it's very evident. I mean, visibly evident and non-visibly evident. We do a lot of work with homeless charities. They're overwhelmed. They don't know how to deal with the demand for their services, and so I can only imagine if that's how the homeless shelters are feeling, then I can't imagine how the housing associations are feeling in this local area because they can't physically keep up with the demand.
Yeah.
What can be done in the private sector? And I don't want to talk too much about this, but is there anything we can regulate in the private sector for landlords that rent properties at a lot, market rates under a certain value to try and cap their rates? Or is there anything that can be done to try and make that more, I don't know, appealing for so we can use it? Because it's obvious now to me that we're not going to build enough social housing. So that's a fact.
Yeah.
So what's the next step? Can we go to the private sector and say, look, we'll incentivize private landlords to make sure these homes are available for affordable rent or whatever? Is there anything you've got any thoughts on that or how we could tackle it from that side?
Well, I'm far from an expert on that, but private landlords predominantly let properties as a business. They've got to cover their costs and they want to make a small amount of profit out of it, or else they put the money in the bank or invest it in some other ways. So it's got to be commercially viable for them. The dilemma, I think, is that what they're seeing and we've seen in our sector is just a significant rise in costs. More latterly, mortgage rates are going up, so landlords have got higher costs there. But also, all the building and repair costs have gone up considerably in the last few years. So the sorts of things that the government are generally saying about inflation, etc., absolutely fundamental to the market. I don't know enough about sort of price regulation. I'm not sure about that. I would worry that in the past, where government have put greater expectation on landlords, and there was a viable option in the social and affordable housing sectors, it wasn't such a big issue.
Yeah.
Now, if they're making it much more difficult for landlords, they're putting higher regulations, standards. They're regulating for higher standards. They're talking about decent homes too, applying to private landlords.
Yeah.
They've changed some of the tax benefits that they get. And a number of landlords are saying, this isn't the business it was. I'm not getting the return on the property. I'm getting a lot of headache. Some great tenants, but some not so great tenants. So I really don't think there's an awful lot they can do. And I wouldn't specifically argue for a lot more regulation on private rented other than on standards issues, and certainly the standards issues absolutely need cracking down on because we see some awful.
I agree. I totally agree.
So on the price point, I don't think there's much about that, but I just think the issue is about market intervention in the right way. I think the government have largely done is increase demand and expectations about home ownership.
Yeah.
They've prioritised things like Help to Buy, when actually they should be doing a lot more in terms of the rental markets and actually supporting people to rent. When an average property is £250,000 or whatever these days, actually the chances of somebody on low incomes getting into that in the medium term is really, really difficult. So there's got to be a good viable rental offer. And I mean, you've probably seen in the press recently the story about the current housing minister talking about we've never built so many social houses, not understanding what a social housing is, not understanding what social rent is, it just beggars belief.
It does.
So, the government have prioritised affordable rent for several years, many years now. Actually, they do need to build more social. They do need to put it in. And I think that would start to change the marketplace a little bit. It would take out some of the demand from the private rental.
It would.
It would start to impact on prices. But there's things that local authorities can do. I mean, we are increasingly trying to work with landlords and doing things around rent guarantee. For a landlord, the biggest worry is that the rent that they've set ain't going to get paid in one way or another. If local authorities can guarantee them that, they sometimes will be prepared to lower the rents a little bit because they know it's a guaranteed. So there's issues to do with, as I said, we've got a small lettings agency where we take on management of the properties, and maybe we need to do more in the local authority sector around actually saying we'll take those on a long-term basis. We'll guarantee your rent for 4 to 5 years. If you're prepared to rent it with us for that period of time, because we know, we can fill virtually any property 10, 20 times at the moment. Our average bid on a council house in Doncaster's something like 40 to 50 people bidding for each property. So there's no problem about letting at this age. That time I talked about in the 80s where we had thousands of empty, don't exist. So, maybe local authorities and maybe even some housing associations could do more around that. We are doing some of that, and some of the housing associations we deal with are doing some of that, particularly in specialist areas like housing first provision and rough sleep provision, etc. Taking on private rented. So I think there's bits about how we can work more collaboratively with private landlords that gets them what they're trying to achieve.
Exactly.
Which isn't seen as being, it's not about conflict. It's not about. It's actually about collaboration and how those two bits of the market can work together to support each other.
Yeah. No, it's a great point, and it's a really interesting subject, but one that probably needs fixing before it gets too wide and we're miles out of kilter with the rest of the world. But I also saw that you introduced a shared accommodation scheme for like healthcare leavers, that have been hit by tax issues, and to try and support them living independently. Just tell us a little bit about that, because I know that's been quite a resounding success, but what was the reason for it in the first place, or what was the issue? And I suppose, what have you seen as the end result of that?
Right, great. I'm delighted you've asked me about that. So we have a small shared accommodation scheme for local authority care leavers.
Right, got you.
And the issue was, there's a number of problems. Firstly, young people getting into suitable accommodation and getting support. We've got a bit of a deficit in Doncaster of single people accommodation. So quite often we were putting care leavers into 2-bedroomed flats where they straight away became eligible for bedroom tax. And the council was sorting that for them. They were paying it, but it created this perverse sort of situation where we put somebody in a flat a bit bigger than they need, and then we're going to mop up the benefit issue, but from a children's services point of view, and again, not unique to Doncaster by any stretch, a large number of people in care that are getting close to being ready to move on and start to live independently, some of which were placed out of Doncaster in very expensive private accommodation. Some of that running to thousands of pounds a week. So massive expense. And what we wanted to do was try and just bring that together. The children's services were doing quite a lot of work in preparing people for independence, but they didn't particularly have housing option to move on to. So we've just brought all that together. Basically, what we now do is we have 8 flats and houses that are all 2-bed. We're aiming to go up to 16, and the Children's Services Department work with matching 2 young people that are prepared to live together, and they get them all prepared, ready. They talk to them about what life independently living is going to be like, and then basically we provide them with accommodation. They have some influence over the decoration. We furnish it. Again, they get to choose some of the furniture. We pay all the utilities, and they pay us roughly the single person allowance that they can get on benefits if they're on benefits. And that basically means that what might have been an £85 a week flat, we are now getting somewhere in the region of £115 a week for that flat. And as a result of that, we can pay the utilities for them. We can put broadband in, we can furnish it. Children's Services give them a daily contact, so support them through it. And we've now had somewhere between 25 and 30 young people through that scheme. And everyone has gone really, really well, with the exception of one where there was a local antisocial behaviour issue that they were a victim of, that we had to move them off that. Other than that, Children's Services have been monitoring the progress, and it's just gone brilliantly. And I was a little bit anxious when we started because, some of these young people had been in out of Doncaster placements, and often the rationale for that has been around their behavioural needs. So we were taking a bit of a risk, but we've had no issues around that. I think we had a couple of lads that had a few parties initially, 17, 18-year-olds are going to have a party now and again, but we've resolved that and sorted it. But on the whole, gone really, really well. And it's a stepping stone. It's a halfway house. That'll get them ready to go into their own property where they're going to pay all the utilities themselves and furnish it themselves, etc. But it's a good start out in life. And I'm kind of, I know it's small, it's not that big, but it's just massive start for those young people.
It gives somebody that one pillar that's really important to build the next pillar, doesn't it? And that's what I love about social housing is it certainly got my mum on her feet at the time she needed it. And I see that with young people. Wrong path, you know where that one leads. Right path, right pillar, good housing with all the things paid for, no stress. You can start to think about the next block, maybe getting a job, doing something different, like depending on how you want to. But I just think that that's a really important step and something you must be really proud about, because it's what we have to do in these communities to try and inspire the next generation to want to do more and want to get back on their feet.
To be honest, James, it's that sort of thing that really makes my career in housing brilliant. It's that sort of stuff that I love when you're having that impact on people's life chances. And they're not just being turfed out into some awful bedsit, and they're in decent accommodation and they're getting the support they need as and when they need it to get them going. And put yourself in their shoes. If you'd had a pretty of a torrid upbringing and you're then living independently in a bedsit at 17, I can imagine what I'd have been like. It wouldn't have been great, So it's a great start, I think, and I'm really pleased and proud of the staff that have been doing that. And what they're achieving.
Well, I know when we did the research for this, and I know how and I love this part of the podcast is it gets me to shine a positive light on what, if you listen to the press or you listen to some of the corners of the world, like you'd think the housing sector is the worst place on earth, but you listen to that story and it tells me all of the things that I need to hear to keep me going on wanting to support this sector. But the other thing that I know you're really proud of is how integral and fantastic work that your tenancy support team do. Just kind of like give us a feel of the stuff that they get involved in and how integral that's been to St. Ledger in terms of your offering and your services.
It's been something that's grown over the last 7 or 8 years. We first introduced it when well before my time with all the benefit changes that started to happen in the middle of last decade, and it's just grown. So it started off predominantly focusing on financial support and advice, making sure people could sustain a tenancy financially. but increasingly that has focused on people's problems are not purely financial, that actually there's a wide range of issues. So we've got upwards of 20 staff now in that team. It's quite a big team for us. And they're doing a whole range of support, not just about their financial situation, although they've had some great success there. I mean, I think last year they were able to help somewhere in the region of 1,200 customers, and I think they helped them get an income gain of over £1 million. You know, it was significant. It's maybe I'm talking 2 years or so, but it was really, really significant.
Yeah.
And that obviously helps us. You know, ultimately we are a business. We do need to collect the rent, but if people have got the money in their pocket, they'll pay the rent. You know, that's what we tend to find. Usually people do prioritise the rent. But increasingly they're going on to other types of support that gets people into difficulties. So we've taken on a couple of specialist mental health workers. We're building up our relationship with the NHS and specialist services there. You know, there's more work done now on things like hoarding, support on around addictions or other health-based issues. So they're doing more and more of that, and the team are really under pressure. They're working incredibly hard, but they're having real success. So I know that our current performance is that of the people referred to them, something like 97% retain their tenancy for at least 6 months. So we're getting few abandonments, we're getting few people pulling out, which is good for them and it's good for us that we're getting that sustainability. So it's absolutely fundamental. And again, I only see that as growing, as a growing part of the business. You know, if we had more cash, we'd do more of it. But it's great. It's great part of the business.
That's amazing. And I saw another piece of good news around Doncaster Council have announced an investment into building and improving the city's social housing. Tell us a little bit about that, because that's a really good thing to look forward to in the future.
Yeah. Well, Doncaster's really committed to try and increase the number of social housing in the borough. And they, just before I came, announced £100 million that they were prepared to put into house building. They've got a 5-year programme, and that's starting to see some real results. I mean, nothing happens overnight, but it's starting to see some results. The other thing that they've decided on this last year, that with the rent being capped at 7%, Doncaster were really not keen to do that. I don't know if I mentioned, but we have something like the 9th lowest rents in the country in England.
You said,
they really do want to prioritise affordability for people. So it was a bit of a conversation between us and the council. This is where those trade-offs come in. I'm saying we need 7%. You know, our prices are going up 10 to 20%. The council's saying you're not having more than 5%. And in the end, the mayor was persuaded that she'd go to 7%, but only if 2% of that went on to buying more properties. So she's given us a budget to buy properties. And since the start of the year, we've bought 6, we've got 20 more going through the legal process. So we're aiming to buy round about 60 properties a year and then refurbish them. Many of those are former right to buys, but we'll buy private properties as well. So we've got those two things going on at the same time. We've got the new build stuff, but we've also got the buy and refurbish work going on. So, fantastic support from Doncaster Council around those sorts of things.
I'm brave, right? Really brave at this point. You know, there's a lot of priorities in the sector. And one thing I wanted to ask you is, like, what do you see some of the key challenges for the sector? I suppose specifically in Yorkshire. I mean, you can go Doncaster if you want, but in Yorkshire, what do you think some of the key challenges we're going to face are? Because it feels like there's a lot. Never been harder to be a chief exec, in my opinion. So many priorities to fix. What are your key challenges that you think we're going to have to tackle in Yorkshire?
Well, we touched on a lot of it already. I think homelessness, rough sleeping, presentations. The difference in the markets and the demand. That's really top notch there at the forefront of my mind. Housing conditions, housing standards. The expectations around the new regulations. The impact that Decent Homes 2 might have, as and when that comes. That's the government's just out for consultation on that at the moment, and there's some stuff in there that you think absolutely brilliant, but really it's going to cost a fortune. Are we going to be able to afford that? The damp and mold stuff, that has been enormous actually.
when the Ombudsman put out a report early last year on damp and mould, and we sort of had a look at it and asked ourselves the question, and we basically said, well, we've got a very small amount of this. It's not a big problem. Come the Awabeshak case, we've been inundated with people. I've got to say, the vast majority of that has been incredibly low stuff. So we're getting people talking to us about the bath seal's gone mouldy and what have you, and the stuff we all get around our showers or whatever.
Absolutely.
But we found one or two serious cases, usually where people haven't told us about it. So that issue about I mentioned earlier about the complexity of some of the people, the complexity of problems faced by some of the people, so linked to mental health issues, maybe linked to hoarding, people living in some really poor conditions. So damp and mold, it's not going away. It's skewing some of the investments, quite understandably, absolutely top notch. And then the other thing that is really pertinent to Yorkshire and probably Manchester, where you are, is just the stuff around the terrace properties and the old traditional properties and the conditions there, and all the stuff around thermal efficiency and energy and bills and what we can do on the carbon zero agenda. So that's a massive issue as well, and an issue that I think many of us have not got the answer to. We know what the investment needs are, but we haven't got the resources to do it. So it's going to need some intervention from government about how we do that if we're going to meet some of those carbon zero challenges we've got, and get the thermal efficiency tenants need. It's, just brought into massive focus with the last year or two with the increasing rises of energy costs. People really struggling, and that issue about damp and mold for us is predominantly driven by people not having the heating on, and we've had instances where people tell us that they're keeping the property. We were advising people to try and keep their property or get their property reach 18 degrees, which we thought was quite conservative. And then it just became evident within months that people weren't doing that. And we've had some instances where we've put data loggers into people's houses at temperatures 10 degrees or so. People just not switching on. We're getting people asking us to cap off the gas. They're not going to use any gas. We've even had people asking us to cap the electricity off. So people are really worried about it. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. And I think on the damp and mold thing, because it comes up a lot, the cost of living thing is so intrinsically linked to damp and mold, isn't it? Because people are just thinking, I'm just going to sit here and make sure I don't spend any money. And as a result, we're going to end up having a further problem. And I don't know if there's something we need to do to intervene in that, because clearly people aren't heating the properties on purpose. It's not negligence, it's a cost thing, in my opinion. So, real difficult one.
It is. We've when we're getting a report of damp and mold, we obviously send the surveyors round, and the surveyors, depending on the issues, automatically refer to our sustainability team to try and ensure people have got the wherewithal to pay the bills, keep the electricity and gas on, etc. So we're trying to do it in that way. That doesn't solve the problem for people if they're just really struggling. But yeah, it's a really complex issue.
No, I agree. And as we finish off, final thing for me was just, as you said yourself, you've been in the sector a long time. What are you excited about, and what do you still want to achieve in your career? And secondly, I suppose, what are you excited for St. Ledger, and what would you like to see in the next few years? Just, leave it on a positive note, but obviously just want to see what you're looking forward to in the next few years.
All right. Well, I guess for me, you can look at all the problems we've got, but what you can't deny is social housing from local authorities and affordable housing has never been in more demand, so people really do need our sector. This is a great place to be at this point in time. You've got to feel like you're doing something incredibly worthwhile. So that's really, really important. We're just in the process of writing a new corporate plan, our business plan, if you like, for the next 5 years, setting out what's important to us. And I guess if I was trying to sort of put that in a couple of sentences, really, that point I was making earlier about this being a people business, this being about how do we support people as best we can when they need it, not in a paternalistic way, but if they need help, how do we help them in ways that are beyond the fact that we've got the roof mended and the pointing done or whatever, when they start to struggle, how can we impact on them? And I think, the thing that really inspires me about social housing is we do have good standards. We do have good space standards. We have good repair standards on the whole. I mean, clearly there's some notable examples of not, but the impact that has on people's life chances is just massive. From the 14-year-old starting to do his GCSEs, having a bit of space to do his homework, to the older people that, need the aids and adaptations they're required to live as healthy a life as they can for as long as they possibly can. So I just think social housing is absolutely fundamental to this country. I do wish there was more of it. I do wish the government took it more seriously. I do wish they'd stop criticising housing associations and local authorities and actually looked at some of the positives, because there are, when you actually get beyond the headlines, there are just positive cases day in, day out of the impact that you've had and the things that you can change. So, I tried to encourage my kids to think about social housing as a sort of career choice. I think I've failed signally. One's gone into business development and business consultancy, and imagine why he's doing that. It's he's going to earn a bit more than he might do with us. But I just think it's a great place to be, and I think it's got a great future.
Yeah, a really nice way to end it, and I couldn't agree with these sentiments more, in the sense that I selfishly love doing this podcast because I hear all the great things that our sector does every week, and it gets the positive messages out. If you listen to some of the stuff you read, I mean, you'd just be in this negative doom loop forever of just all the rubbish that happens. But there's so much good stuff going on, and you must be really proud of the contribution you've made to this sector over the last 20, 30 years and still going to in the future. But I really appreciate you sharing your insights, and I'm sure people are going to get loads of value from this.
Thanks, James. I've really enjoyed it. It's been, it's not quite a desert island disc, but it's a bit of a look back.
I love it. What's your favourite track, Dave? We'll stick it on for the listeners.
when I was thinking about it, and Tom from your company asked me about it, and I started to think back, and I think, oh my God, it is 40 years I've been working.
I didn't want to say the 40 number. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it, Dave.
It's been a real pleasure. Nice to meet you, James.
You too. Cheers. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Hip. If you'd like to hear more from us, please be sure to follow us on your favourite podcast platform. We are also running a 30-minute clinic free of charge to any clients that want to recruit in a more inclusive way. For more information, please reach out to us on our website, andersonjames.com.